In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to extrude polygons along curves. Okay, so what we'll do is use this technique to build out sort of the shape that will be on the front part of this aircraft. So I want to add just sort of a little decorative piece on here just to give this a little bit more of a fantasy type look. Now this will be a really good topic of expanding upon extrusions, which is something that we've had a chance to already look at for building a lot of these other pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with a polygon object that we want to actually extrude. So in my case, I'll start with something like a polygon cube. And I'll go ahead and take the number of divisions in the U. I'll set this up to something like 4. So that way we wind up with 4 polygons right along the top here. Now with this, I'll go ahead and scale this down. Position this up kind of along the top here, since this is sort of where I want this shape to be. And we can take this, maybe scale that down a little bit more. Start with this being kind of narrow and in place. So let's start by taking a few of these different points here. This may be a little bit easier if I switch to my front view and do this from over here. So let's take some of these different points and really just try to round out this top area a little bit. Now I'll start by taking these, all of these different points I should say, and I'll switch to my scale tool. I'll turn on the COG so that way we have the scale manipulator right in the middle. So I'll take this and really pinch these all together just in the x-axis, so that way these are just sort of scaled together just to make this nice little pinch up here at the top. And now I can switch to something like, again, my tag manipulator, or my tag points. So just come in here, press the T key on my keyboard. And now I can come back and again just tag some of these. Pull these down and just trying to round out that top part of this a little bit better. You can probably actually do a little bit better job of that. Trying to get that smoothed out just a little bit more. There we go. So that should work out. I'll go ahead and do the same thing down here toward the bottom. So taking some of these points down here, again just tag those and very gradually start to pull those up. Okay, very good. So that should work out pretty well for us. I might just take this whole piece and make this a little bit smaller, since that is a little bit large to begin with. Okay, so with that, let's now start to build out our little curve that we're going to use here. Now what I'd like to do is again start to create a pretty extravagant shape up here. Now rather than trying to simply extrude and try to shape this all into place, we can actually use a series of curves to control the direction and the shape of my extrusion. So while I have this piece separated, I'll go ahead and duplicate this. Just press Ctrl D to duplicate. I'll switch to my scale tool, or rather my rotate tool. Press and hold Shift and rotate that 180 degrees. And I'll put the same shape down here toward the bottom. So that should work out really well for us. Now let's go ahead and draw out the curves that we're going to use to control this extrusion. So in this case, I'm going to jump to my side view. Go ahead and press the G key on my keyboard to turn off my grid. Make this a little bit easier to see. And we can go ahead and just draw a normal curve. So we'll go to Create Curve and draw cubic by CVs. Now, if you recall, we want to make sure that we draw our curves always in a counterclockwise motion. So in this case, that means I'm going to have to start out toward the end and carry this counterclockwise back toward my cube here. So we'll start sort of somewhere out here and just sort of bring this across and back to our cube. When we're done, just tap the space bar on our keyboard. Now in my case, we can always come back and still make manipulations to this. So if we want to be able to move this curve down a little bit more, we can certainly do that. Maybe also take some of these points and bring those maybe back up. So that way we get something maybe a little bit more straight across. The beauty of what we're about to do is the fact that it's very non-destructive, so we will still have these curves to be able to come back and work with if we want to change the shape at all. Let's go ahead and make another curve that we'll use to extrude this shape down here. So once again, we can just go to Create Cubic by CVs. Let's make sure we actually have our curve deselected, so that way it thinks we're not trying to add on to the existing curve. Again, make sure we carry this curve in a counterclockwise motion, so this time we're going to start up here, and we're going to just start to draw our way down. So whenever you're drawing these curves, just try to use really as few curve points as possible. That'll make sure that you get nice smooth curvature wherever you need it. So I'll just sort of carry this shape down and around, and then sort of back underneath, just sort of like that. Now again, if I choose to, I can always come back and tag some of these points. Maybe if I find that this curvature is not quite what I want, that becomes really, really easy to come in and manipulate. Okay, so we have our main shapes here. Now let's actually start the extrusion process and watch how this unfolds. So we can start with this shape up here. Again, I'll just press the U key on my keyboard. I'll grab these polygons all up front. And now let's go to Modify Polymesh. And whereas before we've been using this Extrude Along Axis function, this time we're going to choose Extrude Along Curve. Now we're going to choose the curve that we want to extrude along. And you can see this is a perfect example of what's going to happen if my curves have been drawn incorrectly. So remember I mentioned that we needed to draw these in a counterclockwise direction. But in this case, you'll notice for this top curve, I actually drew it in a clockwise direction instead of around this way. And this is what's going to happen if your curves have been reversed. So essentially, Softimage thinks that this is the very end of the curve instead of down here. Now, this doesn't mean that this is completely destroyed. We can still salvage this curve. Just go ahead and grab the curve, go to Modify Curve, and now let's inverse. It's actually going to be down here toward the bottom, so we can inverse that curve. There we are, and now we can force that to flow properly. So now let's go back to our polygon object here, go back to our Selection Explorer, and revisit that extrude op. So within this extrusion, this is where we can start to control just how many divisions we have here. We can also start to control the inset amount, so as we start to dial that up or down, we can begin scaling our geometry. What I'd actually like to do is start to increase these scaling values. So as we start to dial these down, we should start to get a little bit more of a pinch here at the end, which in my case, this is what I'm going for here. So just kind of pinching that down. We can control whether this happens on a per subdivision level or not. So with this on a per subdivision level, you'll see that this taper starts to happen very, very gradually at first, and then it becomes much more rapid as we progress. Whereas if we turn that off, we should start to see something that is much more gradual and uniform all the way through. Okay, so that should work out pretty well. We'll go ahead and close out of this extrude. Now let's do the same down here. So I'm going to grab, again, these 4 polygons up front, modify polygon, and extrude along curve. Choose the curve, and it looks like in this case we may have had a similar issue where maybe that curve has been drawn incorrectly. So that's okay. We should be able to come in and fix that, again, by just inverse that curve. So modify curve and inverse. Okay, and again, let's select our cube and revisit that extrude op. So in this case, we can now start to increase the number of divisions in here. And just because we are maxing out at 10 doesn't mean that we can't overdrive this value, so we could always come in and type in something higher. We could also type in the value to actually change this on a per knot basis. So that way it actually pays a little bit more attention to the actual shape and the knot positioning of this curve underneath. Normally it will just try to evenly space these out, but again, with that per knot option, we'll do a little bit better job of actually conforming that to the shape of some of these underlying knots. Again, always a good idea to try to use the minimal amount of geometry that you can get away with. So in my case, I'll start with something like maybe just 1 division per knot. And once again, we can come in and start to take this scaling and begin dropping this down again, just very, very gradually. If we want, this can sometimes become a little bit easier. If we were to just highlight this, we can start to use things like our middle mouse wheel to actually adjust these values. So sometimes these will work just fine. Sometimes they take a little bit more massaging and tweaking around. Sometimes it's also just becomes even a better idea to just try to manually type in your numbers if the keyboard shortcuts aren't having quite the desired effect. So in my case, I'm just trying to kind of collapse that down and get that to be a little bit smaller as we progress kind of up through here. Again, might be a good idea to maybe take my transform per subdivision down, so that way I can have maybe a little bit more gradual, a little bit more natural transition from this sort of wide shape on up into something that's going to be a little bit more narrow. So as you can see, definitely a tremendous amount of control that we have over these extrusions, and this is obviously much, much easier than trying to manually extrude and shape our polygons into this particular alignment. So extruding along a curve, again, something that is extraordinarily useful when it comes to modeling some of these more complex polygon shapes. So what we'll do in our next lesson is take a look at how we can start to join these two pieces together and start to really kind of clean up and fix up any issues that we may encounter with these extruded shapes.